As I mentioned, this program is named after Ambassador Robert Skip Orr. Skip was his nickname as he was affectionately called by those closest to him. Skip was an alumni of FAU. He was most known for being the U.S. ambassador to the Asian Development Bank. Moreover, Skip was the chairman for the ADB. He would be the first American to ever chair that organization in its entire history. On top of that, Skip was the chairman of the board for the Panasonic Foundation, as well as the vice chair for the National Association of Japan-America Studies. He would serve as the vice president for Motorola, both in Europe and in Motorola, Japan. Later, under the guidance of Ambassador Thomas Pickering, Skip became the president of Boeing Japan. In 2018, Skip's career culminated with the Order of the Rising Sun with gold rays and rosette. That is the highest honor that Japan gives to a citizen. As Skip told me, that was the last honor given by the Emperor of Japan before he passed on the throne. Skip lived for one purpose, and that was to connect and help people. As an FAU alumni, Skip saw the potential to emulate his own career. He wanted to give access to mentors so that they can do what they did for him. He wanted to pass the torch to the next generation. So a few of his students, when he taught at FAU, came together and we all had a common goal. We wanted to develop meaningful conversations with established leaders in the context of international relations. In the height of the pandemic, when the world was locked at home, Skip helped bring these students together. And with his fellow ambassadors, upper-level diplomats, and premier influencers in domestic and international politics, he made this a reality. And this program is a true testament to that. You see, unfortunately, Skip passed away in August 2021. And he will be missed, but what I see here today shows that he is still with us, and he will continue to be. I think it's only fitting that this new iteration of Ambassador Talks should relaunch with Skip's mentor, Ambassador Thomas Pickering. I would like to introduce my two partners in this endeavor, without whom I could not have made today possible. And that is Skip's close friend, Walter Poik, and a mentee of Skip, Corey Hancock. Corey will be speaking next. He is an FAU alumni, and he's the current supervisory program director for U.S. aid in Mexico. So Corey, you're welcome to take the stage.
Thanks so much, Stefan, for that nice introduction. And hi, and good morning to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, especially to Miko, who's joining us from Japan, to Ambassador Pickering, and to Walter as well. And as Stefano was mentioning before, Ambassador Talks started when Skip was teaching at FAU. He assembled a group of students, small, intimate group, and he would bring in his friends, his colleagues, and those who can provide experiences to the students. And so upon his untimely passing, we had a strong desire to keep the program running, and that's exactly what we're doing today. I just also want to give a tip of the hat again to Walter Poik for all of the guidance, and really all the glory goes to Stefan Schneider. This is his initiative. He's running the show, and I really admire his persistence and his ability to get the ball rolling again. And so the mission's the same. They're student-centered discussions. We're focused on diplomacy, international relations, international affairs. We hope in the coming weeks and months to feature a wide variety of speakers, those who can speak on topics pertaining to government, diplomacy, private sector, NGOs, nonprofits, etc. We're looking for people who could speak on many different issues there. And so for me personally, the reason why I'm involved in this program is it's a fondness for FAU. I have a strong desire to help current students, and if I can share my professional experiences with them, just the way that I benefited from many mentors during my time at FAU, then I think it will be successful. I also want to recognize the professors at FAU who've helped us out a lot. Specifically, 3 of them deserve mention. That's Drs. Morton, Lowe, and Dr. Horswell. Thank you, and I thank the others for helping to assemble this group of students that we have here today. And so briefly, we have an excellent speaker today, a 7-time ambassador, which is, and Ambassador Pickering has a distinguished diplomatic career, and I'm just as excited as everyone else to hear his perspectives. And so we have a unique opportunity to learn from his experiences. And so for the students, I encourage you to ask questions about the content, but also about career options, career opportunities. For those students at FAU who are interested in a career in diplomacy, go ahead and ask. Entering the Foreign Service is a very competitive endeavor. FAU students are uniquely prepared for it. And so if you have any questions about that, please do ask those as well. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Stefan. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tori. So you all will have an opportunity to ask questions to the ambassador. The way that we'll work that is if you have a question, we ask you to please send a private chat to Mr. Hancock, to Corey. Corey's going to put all your questions together, and when it comes to the time to ask questions, he will call on your name, and you'll have a chance to ask your question. So before we get on to Ambassador Pickering, we're going to briefly hear from Skip's wife, Miko, who has graciously joined us from Japan. So Miko, welcome to Ambassador.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you so much, everyone, participating in this program and also continuing this program. And I would like to really, thank you. Thanks for Ambassador Pickering. He was my husband mentor, and at the Boeing company, Skip was the president of Boeing Japan. And Ambassador Pickering was boss of total global leadership. And 2002, for the first Boeing meeting, international meeting, Ambassador Pickering organized the meeting in Moscow, and we stayed in a beautiful hotel in front of Kremlin. And at that time, it was a great experience to get to know Russia. And Ambassador Pickering was always a very impressive diplomat, and not only as a diplomat and ambassador, his personality was so fantastic. And just the other day, we had a memorial dinner party in Tokyo. And Ambassador Pickering gave us a most wonderful message about Skip, and everybody was so impressed. And also, thank you so much for tonight. And I will thank you for all from bottom of my heart. Thank you. And please continue.
Wonderful. Thank you, Miko. It's so nice for you to join us for this. Skip meant so much to us, and his spirit, we hope, will live on through this program as we help these students develop and emulate what Skip meant to the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
So next up, I'm pleased and honored to introduce a man who really needs no introduction, because we all have read about him, we've all followed his career, but his resume is really so amazing that I kind of need to share his resume with you. Ambassador Thomas Pickering holds the personal rank of Career Ambassador. That is the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service. His career has spanned over 5 decades. He was, during that time, the ambassador to the Russian Federation, India, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan. From 1989 to 1992, he was the ambassador and U.S. representative to the United Nations in New York. His last assignment with the Department of State was as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, where he served from 1997 to the year 2000. Upon leaving government, Ambassador Pickering served as the Senior Vice President for International Relations and as a member of the Executive Council of the Boeing Corporation. He served for a total of 5.5 years. He is the Vice Chairman at Hills and Company, where he provides advice and counsel to a number of U.S. enterprises based on his incredible experience. Ambassador Pickering received a bachelor's degree with high honors in history from Bowdoin College and his master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He received a second master's degree while on a Fulbright scholarship at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Ambassador Pickering speaks French, Spanish, and Swahili, and he also has some fluency in Arabic, Hebrew, and Russian. Most of all, Ambassador Pickering was the mentor to our dear Skip. So it is my dear pleasure to invite Ambassador Pickering to Ambassador Talks. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you, Stefan, very much. And let me, before we begin our discussion, say how pleased I am to join all of you, students, faculty, friends, and others. Skip was a great friend and had a wonderful career both at Boeing, prior to Boeing, but also after in the American Diplomatic Service as a long-serving and uniquely equipped to contribute ambassador to the Asian Development Bank in Manila, an activity that in many ways was largely oriented toward Japanese generosity. And as a result of Skip's experience and language skill, he played a very, very important part in promoting American diplomacy in the Pacific Ocean and Asian region of the world. And we have much to thank Skip for, and we were all shocked and obviously hurt by his early departure from this life and the difficulties that I know this has caused his friends. We mourn him, we miss him, we grieve for him, and we, in every sense of the word, know that he is resting in peace and a knowledge of a life well lived. Miko, it's wonderful to see you again after so many years, and we're so grateful here in my end of the conversation for your very kind words, as we are also for Colin's words and his introduction from Mexico City. It's a wonderful meeting. We have Vienna, Mexico City, and Japan immediately hooked up to Washington and to Florida. And I suppose, Stefan, there are people from other points, but let me not drag out the introductions any longer. I'm anxious to get started and whatever might be on your mind and on the minds of your students, and look forward to the opportunity to speak with them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that, Ambassador Pickering. I think we should definitely dive in because there really is so much to talk about. So this event is focused on Ukraine. And while towards the end, we will talk about some career development as well, I think that it's so pressing into what's going on in the world. And with that, I have my first question, which is, why should we care about what is going on in Ukraine?
I think it's a very important question, and my feeling is that as citizens of the world, we should care about things going on in all corners of the world. And this is not only because they affect us, but they affect our fellow mankind. And I think that's the broad moral justification. But it is very clear, too, that the US has serious interests in that part of Europe and turmoil in any part of the world in which the United States has serious interests, whether those are political, security, economic, commercial, or otherwise. The US has to both defend and help to protect people and friendships it's formed around the world. The shock to all of us of the Russian invasion of Ukraine raised another issue, and President Putin was foremost in putting that before us. The indication that he was potentially capable of using nuclear weapons at some point in this military campaign he's pursuing against Ukrainians is indeed a deep shock. Many of us lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we know, particularly in the aftermath of the studies of that crisis, both sides came closer to use of weapons of that sort, nuclear weapons of mass destruction, than they realized during the crisis. And anything that brings nuclear use closer brings closer to us a situation in which, as I say often, because I spent a good bit of my career in arms control and disarmament, the world knows the many ways in which we could stumble by accident, by miscalculation, by misstatement into nuclear use, but we don't know any way once these exchanges begin how to stop them. And that is a very unnerving prospect because the capacity of these weapons is such that mankind as a whole is under a deep threat, and no one wants to see that play out. And it's another reason why we should oppose both aggression from one country to another, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or somewhere else, and at the same time do everything we possibly can to assure that the use of military force is not prolonged.
So you have a very unique perspective from most analysts talking about the Ukraine crisis, and that is that you have enormous experience on the ground as an ambassador. So for our audience, could you let us know what are the ambassadors doing during a crisis like this? How does an ambassador help end this crisis?
I think first and most importantly, they keep open the line of communications as best they can with the countries concerned. I think you would not consider it objectionable if I mentioned that one American fault in dealing with people with whom we have developed animosities and differences is that we like to believe that conferring the opportunity to converse with us is a right and privilege they have to earn, often at the expense of some interest they have. When the truth is that both of us benefit from continued communications, and people as famous as former Prime Minister of Israel, Rabin, often say that you don't make peace with your friends, you have to make peace with your enemies. And to make peace, you have to communicate. And the best form of communication is direct, face-to-face communications, although often you may have to do this through the assistance of friends and facilitators and mediators. That's less helpful at times, but nevertheless, it's important. And so that, I think, remains a major tenet. Secondly, ambassadors tell Washington from their own observation and from the observation of the people in the embassy they lead who work for them, what we are seeing and hearing in the country concerned. It is often the one source of direct insight into how foreign leaders look at questions. Ambassadors have access to foreign leaders and can talk with them, ask them questions about what they're thinking about, as well as what is going on, and report that back. And I think third, but in my view, often in first place, is ambassadors who have significant experience in a country can provide suggestions to their own governments, in my case, to Washington, about what we ought to do about the crisis at hand, what policy options we should think about, which ones you would recommend, why are those particular options being recommended, what is the factual basis that lies behind that kind of recommendation, and how and in what way you as ambassador and the country as a whole should present those thoughts, ideas, and indeed suggestions for policy changes to foreign leaders, to foreign publics, to Americans, to the American Congress, within the American executive branch, and to our foreign friends, all of whom in one way may be affected. The US is a tremendously powerful country, both economically, politically, in principles and in values. And what it says has important meaning for many countries around the world, And the American ambassador is one of the principal speakers on behalf of the United States in a particular country around the world. But those words don't stay locked up, if I could put it this way, in the bilateral exchange channels country to country. They often receive wide press coverage and publicity around the world. So it is part of a concerted activity in which Washington plays a major role in assuring that the words that are spoken fit the policy. They are part of the strategy being pursued. And they, in one way or another, synchronize with what other parts of the US government is saying, so we can achieve the most effectiveness of the use of information as part of the diplomatic toolbox.
So you mentioned the importance of face-to-face communication, the power of being in the same room with your counterpart to help try to achieve some common goal. Do you think that the pandemic is getting in the way of maybe getting a resolution to this matter?
I'm sure it stands in the way. I'm not, however, sure that we haven't developed some methods of working around the exigencies, if I could call it that way, of the pandemic, masking, isolation, remoteness at times, and the cut down or the lowering of the intensity of communications. I think that we miss certainly the value of face-to-face communications when they're cut off or not available, whether it's because of the pandemic, because of the busy schedule of a foreign leader, because of policies not to talk, which I said a moment ago, I thought were almost always badly conceived of policies, but nevertheless, they form part sometimes of a country's strategy to achieve their objectives. And at the same time, I think that virtual discussions, such as we're having today, can play their own role in moving things ahead. Virtual discussions allow one to assemble at short notice people from a wide number of places. We don't have to all travel extensive distances to be in the same room together. They give an opportunity for people to speak, hopefully in an orderly manner, and hopefully in a way that is constructively led so that the conversations can unfold in directions that have strategic value and significance, rather than to be a kind of cacophony of noise, which often, as we know, is how sometimes things degenerate if in fact leadership is not around in the form of a mediator or a facilitator of talks or a chosen chairman for the meeting who is prepared to be disciplined and indeed useful in seeking an outcome. Often states have problems agreeing on agendas for talks. Nevertheless, ambassadors can be very useful in their own way in saying, we've talked to people in and they think these are the following topics. And it occurs to us that if we start with this progression and we have picked up on things that they will find easier to talk about first to break the ice and ships that are in diplomatic communication.
Ambassador Pickering, you seem to be jumping in and out. I think your connection is a little bad. I'm going to ask if all audience members could turn off their video. That might assist in the connection.
Thank you, Stefan. I can see you. I hope you can hear me.
Okay, yeah, you were a little computerized, and I see that your connection's kind of jumping back up in the options. So thank you, everyone, for cooperating with that. Okay,
I just proved some of the frailties of virtual communications.
Indeed. And hopefully it's for the sake of future crises, it's something they fix quite soon. So I guess it's a complex question, but it's also very simple. And it's one that all of us, I'm sure, are very eager to know. How did we get here? How did we, like, what led to Russia and Putin deciding to invade Ukraine?
Well, let me be as frank as I can, and let me look at this as much as one can from both sides. If we knew more precisely why Mr. Putin had done what he's done, we would have a better answer to trace back the historical roots of this particular problem. The answer is, of course, we don't. And there are people who believe he's gone out of his senses. There are people who believe he has made serious mistakes. There are people who believe that the US played absolutely no role in the lead up to this. This just came out of the blue and was a Russian preoccupation. On the Russian side, which I have heard, even if I've said clearly I don't understand, they portrayed a series of concerns that they had, including obviously the loss of a world power position with the failure of communism at the end of 1991. The situation in which they saw NATO enlargement as a threat to them in security terms, rather than purely defensive arrangements to bring into NATO countries recently released from a sphere of Russian influence and the Warsaw Pact, and a result that played a role. We are also watching this situation develop in the context of a situation in which I think we need to focus our attention, even if we don't agree with it. Succession of leadership in Russia, whether under the old rule of the czars before the First World War, on the subsequent rule of the communists in the period leading up to 1991, but during the years from 1991 until now, has always been plagued by the uncertainties of how that would take place. Most often somebody died, but most often then there was a system for appointing a successor, but no certainty that the system was going to appoint a certain successor. It was not elections, however. It was the choice of people primarily influential in the leadership of the country. And while the monarchy had a state succession arrangement where people knew in advance, that disappeared. And the communist world had a state succession operation, but sometimes it took several iterations of short-term successors before somebody emerged with a permanent position. It is also true that state succession in Russia tended to produce grave uncertainty for anybody who was losing power or anybody contending power who didn't succeed in gaining power, whether that was in prison or sometimes even worse. And so Mr. Putin, particular times in his own career, particularly in the period between the first decade and the second decade of this century, saw growing uncertainty about their political popularity and position. And I think adopted a course of action to promote Russian nationalism as a policy objective and to promote Russian spheres of influence, to reinforce and buttress that nationalism, to promote dividing the US away from Europe, to promote objection to American policies, and to promote as malign, threatening, and dangerous American policies. And over the years, an information system in Russia, over which he had a great deal of control, tended to dominate the scene in Russia, particularly in the supply of information, that emphasized these very divisive, very challenging, and very difficult positions. Coming out of this, over the long term, Mr. Putin advocated two ideas. One, that Ukraine was really not an independent nation. These were people who helped to bring Christianity to Russia more than 1,000 years ago, but they were all part of a Russian grouping, now best led from and dominated by Moscow, and now best informed through the Russian language, not offshoots of other Slavic tongues like Ukrainian or White Russian or so on, that Moscow saw as inferior and subordinate to its own interests. This, in effect, was the buildup that President Putin gave to his own people for the action that he took. Certain steps that we had taken were preyed upon. Certain steps that Ukrainians had taken were advanced as reasons for Russia to be uncertain about Ukrainians' aims with regard to Russia. A good bit of this was in the category of being made up. A good bit of it was material that had been taken for perfectly plausible and understandable reasons, having nothing to do with the subjection of Russia, but interpreted by President Putin for his own people as having exactly that aim. And so it was in February 23rd, after quite a long period in which the US, in an amazing way, used its own intelligence information, often kept secret to protect its sources, to indicate to our friends around the world, to Ukrainians in particular and to others, that Russia was building up to invade them. And we did what we could to block that. Some of us believe we should have been more forceful and indeed maybe more rapid in our movements to strengthen the Ukrainians. We have been in many ways surprised in a pleased way by the degree to which the Ukrainians met the onslaught of Russian force following the buildup. And it's been very impressive. And we have worked very hard, including the president signing within the last 24 hours of a $40 billion appropriation by the American Congress to continue to provide economic and military assistance to Ukraine in its battle, obviously, to defend itself against Russian aggression. So this is sort of how we got here, and this is sort of where we are. And I think there are several things we need to watch. One of those is that we not move in any way at all that will cut off Ukrainian-Russian negotiating contacts, which now seem to be frozen, that can help the two parties find a way out of this particular contention that Russia has generated. That won't come soon, but it is not certain it won't come at all. But much of what will to determine that will come as the result of four factors, and I'll say them very quickly. One is the continued ability of the Ukrainians to provide military and security resistance to the Russian onslaught. Very important. Secondly, the effectiveness of sanctions, particularly in cutting Russia off from the financial world, including a large share of the $630 billion Russia has amassed in foreign exchange earnings as part of its helpful fund for emergencies. Thirdly, the maintenance of political isolation of Russia and the strengthening of that. And I think while the votes at the UN were not perfect, they were not so terrible in many ways that the Russians didn't get the idea that not only the Europeans, but people all around the world took umbrage at their actions in invading Ukraine and opposed them. And I think finally something that we have yet to produce, but I think could be very powerful, which is to find a way to reduce income to Russia from its export of oil and gas, whether it's to the Europeans or elsewhere. And that will require bringing together the producers of oil and gas outside of Russia to meet shortfalls, ways to increase production to reduce costs, because Russia is now in effect in a bad way using its invasion of Ukraine to raise the income that it derives from the increased price of oil and gas directly as a result of that invasion. And we will have to seek to find ways, if we can, to take a position of one, relieving scarcity of oil and gas, and at the same time reducing the cost. And I would add, and this is for the future, but also important, bringing the producers of hydrocarbons together around a new consortium, which can also work together on renewable energy, because we're not going to have hydrocarbons forever. We need to husband those for the things that cannot be replaced, but we also need, for a whole series of reasons, excuse me, to find ways to engage in further investment in renewable energy and all of the attributes of renewable energy.
I'm not sure if we lost Stefan there.
We may have, Corey, do you want to?
I think I'm back.
Oh, there he is.
Here he is, good.
I do apologize for that.
Stefan, you're back. Thanks, Corey.
Ambassador, if I could ask you, can you lower your camera a little bit? We're seeing a lot of your ceiling.
Sure.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So I do apologize for that interruption. Ambassador, was there anything you wanted to finish in that line of
I
thinking?
did, Stefan. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, say again? Okay, well, so I do apologize for that interruption. Ladies and gentlemen, that right there, I just wanted to show a true master who knows exactly what he's talking about, because miraculously, Ambassador Pickering managed to answer about half the questions I had prepped right there. And he had no idea what I was going to ask, yet he did so. So I'm going to go a little bit off script here because we're now in the present tense. And the one thing I would like to know is, you mentioned, Ambassador Pickering, the lead up to the invasion and how order really may not have done enough, that there were some Putin's invocation of and really is unstable.
Yeah.
Stefan, I've lost your audio.
Okay, Ambassador, can you hear me, sir?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect. So let me ask you a question then. For career development, so let's imagine that you're speaking to a room full of 40 undergraduate students who are probably between 20 and 23 years of age. Oh, wait a second, you probably are. Great. What advice would you have for those who are interested in diplomacy, in foreign policy, considering careers in the government, whether it's with the State Department, USAID, whether it's with Commerce or the Ag Department? What source of advice and recommendations would you give them, and what do they need to know about, and what are the pitfalls that they might come across?
Well, I think that because, as you pointed out, Corey, entrance is competitive through a competitive examination route, prepare yourself. And I think it would be pursue courses of study which will give you an indication of confidence about your knowledge base in a wide variety of subjects, particularly political, economic, and security issues that are front and center in US preoccupations at the present time. Years ago, they used to say the best preparation for entering the Foreign Service was to read all of the New York Times every day. Now we have other sources, but nevertheless, it's not necessarily a bad idea for you to supplement your coursework with a lot of outside reading, whether it's in the blogosphere, whether it's from other sources that you like and can depend on, but a variety of sources, because immediately people will want to know, are you broad gauge? Do you understand the information flow? Do you understand how to segregate as much as you can, truth from falsehood. Do you understand how to relate it? I would say do everything you can to write. Become a good writer. Good writing is a skill. It's learned. I never cease learning in that particular area. And in fact, one of the things that I think should characterize a successful American diplomat is a statement that I often use with new entrants and old friends. I said, the day when you don't learn something new is a day truly wasted. And something new can be a lot or it can be a little. But that's an extremely important part of where you're going. And it makes a great deal of sense to be able to master that. Diplomats need to listen as much as they talk. And in fact, I'm proving the opposite here with you today, but that may be a special case. But I think the development of good listening skills is very important. Good listening skills in the first instance will convey to you what people are actually conversation skills. Will take that to the next step. You will be able to investigate often what they mean, because often diplomats, when they begin to talk, say what they have to say, but need to develop further their own understanding of what they mean. And even more punishing and trying is the third stage of listening, when you work hard and begin to find out what they will settle for. What is the bottom line that you could anticipate coming out of a conversation to deal with the problem? And diplomats have conversations that are almost always related to a problem. It may not be obvious to begin with, but it is not something people waste time in idle conversation. And usually even introductory niceties are derived in a way to try to build a relationship to deal with a difficult problem coming up down the road. And that's important. Diplomacy is a product of personal relations. And it would be a mistake to believe that diplomats are two humanized robots, repeating material sent to them from their capitals with no give, no indication of learning, no ability other than to report exactly what the other side said, and no mission around to use what's going on to resolve the problems. It's all exactly the opposite, but it's why telephone conversations are helpful, but limited. Virtual conversations are helpful, but limited. Face-to-face conversations are remarkably useful. And I have never been in a situation where the discussion of new ideas in a small group did not produce new and interesting ways from the very participants in those groups of how to look at a particular set of ideas as cast against their usefulness in resolving a problem. It is a very interesting dynamic. Similarly, growing willingness to speak honestly to each other, often on a one-to-one basis in private, is a characteristic of good diplomacy. And this can be very valuable, and it can help to produce answers, and in some cases can help to even produce conditions where diplomats who know each other and trust each other can, in the course of a short conversation, cover a set of difficult and challenging problems in a new and different way, so that at the end of the conversation, they can say to each other, I'll do this and this, and I understand you're going to do this and this, and we'll check their follow-on actions we're going to take have helped us to mature a set of ideas to deal with this problem.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. Can you hear me?
I sure can. Thanks, Corey.
Perfect. I have a couple of questions here from the crowd, but first I'd like to turn over to Dr. Jeffrey Morton, who's a professor of who's a professor at Florida Atlantic University, and he's the director of the Leon Charney Diplomacy Program. So over to you, Dr. Morton.
Ambassador Pickering is often referred to as America's greatest living diplomat, and deservedly so. I was very fortunate to watch him firsthand at, I think, the pinnacle of his career, certainly his most important diplomatic endeavor. In 1990, I worked for the Office of the Undersecretary General, Ronald Spires, at the United Nations. And when Iraqi forces rolled into Kuwait, I attended those closed Security Council sessions, interfaced with the permanent mission of the US across the street. And it was remarkable to watch Ambassador Pickering stitch together and then hold together a Security Council vote to condemn the Iraqis' invasion, annexation, to establish the economic sanctions, and then ultimately the authorization for military force. In 1990, really the only viable option for rescuing Kuwait from Iraq was military. But today in Ukraine, Mr. Ambassador, there's a third element, in addition to, of course, the military response and the government authorized sanctions. Private sector sanctions are devastating the Russian economy. And tens of thousands of jobs are gone forever, and Russia will pay for this economically for the rest of this century. My question for you, is this new force something that has legs? Should China be gravely concerned that if it were to make a military move on Taiwan, that it would face the same sort of public backlash and refusal to purchase its products that Russia is today?
It's a great question. And before you take it any further, thank you for your kind remarks. But also, I think you might know that Ronald Spires, for whom you worked, lived across the street from me. He offered me a very early, fascinating job working for him, and was, if anything, the best mentor I had in my whole Foreign Service experience. So we enjoyed, in a sense, a mutual benefit in working for someone that I certainly admired. I think private sanctions are fascinating, and I think it's a very good and important point to raise. I think they do not exist within a set of relationships that doesn't reflect government attitudes and government actions. The primary motivation, at least for some privates,
Have we lost the ambassador?
Yeah.
Oh.
would hope to.
Still on the call. I just think he is. Oh no, we lost him.
There are also questions that I think are very important, and I hope you're still hearing me, that in one way or another reflect what we would call the moral attitudes of public opinion. And private sector organizations often, because it is good business, respond to issues that come up, which in one way or another are going to reflect the popularity of their products and their selling and marketing potential, because in effect, a situation has deteriorated between a home base of that company and a foreign market being then developed and used to promote the products of a foreign manufacturer. Those are some of the, put it this way, risks of doing business outside your home base. They're not unusual, and we have seen things like supply chain freezing and supply chain adversity as affecting certainly both as a result of the pandemic, but also of the growing, if I could put it this way, contention in US-China relations as part of the issues. And to some extent, this private sector activity is clearly a basis of how and in what way the business risk attached to continuing to do business as usual is getting too high and too unfavorable for the company concerned. I worked for a great American company for 5 years. The name is mentioned. I don't have to repeat it. It does a lot of business in Russia. That business has been frozen in part because of the invasion of Ukraine and all of the contentions that have emerged around it, and in part, obviously, by judgments, which I haven't participated in, because I haven't been associated with them now for 15 to 17 years, their judgments about business risk. And so those are in part a section of complex and important issues. Business firms don't like to take positions contrary to the interests of the governments where they have their primary business location. But we also find that businesses, many of them are becoming truly international. And while they may have a headquarters in one country, the notion that a very large share of both their manufacturing and sales is confined to one country has become less and less likely, and more likely that they have a huge global international footprint. And to some extent, that footprint and its success is enhanced by their ability to develop a global production arrangement through suppliers and through directly owned manufacturing facilities and R&D and so on all around the world to take advantage of the wealth of ideas that come up from other places, take advantage of obviously monetary advantages and lower labor costs in some places, the greater availability of well-educated people in other places, tradition in some places of capacity in one or a number of fields of endeavor of interest to that company.
Thanks, Ambassador. For the next question, I'd like to turn over to the chair of the history department at Florida Atlantic University, Dr. Ben Lowe, who has a question to ask you.
Hello, Ambassador Pickering. It's a great pleasure to be able to meet and talk with you here today. One of the other great pleasures of my life has been to get to know Ambassador Skip Orr when he came to FAU and taught for my department some courses. And we had many great conversations together about history and politics. Just a really wonderful, many sessions that I spent with him. I just to say really quickly before I get to my question, I have my students read Francois de Callière. I'm an early modernist, and maybe you've heard of him, who wrote an early book on diplomacy. And I was really fascinated by the characteristics that you named. Some of them are what he was saying should be true of ambassadors way back in the 17th century. So that was really fascinating. I guess my question has to do more with the Ukraine situation. I know, President Zelensky, he defeated Poroshenko a few years ago, and that was a huge change, or at least people thought, within Ukraine itself. And they thought this was going to lead to some changes. And then there was some, politically, the corruption and things like that within the country was true. And then there was a real backlash for a while. And then suddenly now he seems to have risen to the occasion. What do you think is happening internally, politically, especially as it moves more towards now this Western orientation? Where do you think that comes from, and what do you see as the future for that country politically?
It's a great question, Dr. Lowe, and thank you very much. And it's one that we have tended to overlook in the almost undivided attention we have given to the military conflict. And obviously the imperative of not losing the military conflict has been an important part of that heavy attention. And someone said the other day to me that we spent a great deal of time, and indeed I have been in touch with Ambassador Yovanovitch, who worked for me in Moscow, about Ukraine recently. She didn't say this, but someone did in the context of these kinds of conversations that we've been having. That the whole question of the problem of corruption seems to have disappeared from the American press coverage. I don't think it's disappeared entirely from a problem in Ukraine, although one would hope that President Zelensky, in his leadership, in his ability to speak truth as he sees it, and his deep opposition, as he's explained it, to corruption, and the imperative of saving the state and not allowing things like corruption to undermine the unity and the support which he has achieved as a result of his own personal sterling performance in defending the interests of Ukraine and explaining those to the rest of the world, will not permit that to happen. There is nothing worse than obviously having success rotted out from the inside. And one would know that you can't spend all of your time fighting the medium and long-term problems if you don't defend yourself on the short-term ones, which are the most threatening. And so we see some of that. I think that it is interesting too, that there are other questions here that in one way or another need to be addressed. I spoke briefly a moment ago about the notion that one had to continue conversations. We are having, to the best of my knowledge, no real conversations with the Russians, and that the activities against our embassy in Moscow have included cutting it off from communications with senior Russian officials, something that when I was there, we were lucky enough to enjoy on a wide-scale basis. And that can be very damaging because embassies which become prisoners of non-communication, if I can phrase it that way, become less and less valuable, and you don't have many other sources or insights who in one way or another understand enough about American interests to tell you what is really going on and how and what way we can really carry out what it is we are seeking to do with respect to the country. The return of our embassy to Kyiv is a valuable and important step to rectify a problem that grew up when, for security reasons, we had to withdraw from there as the Russians surrounded Kyiv, and now with the Herculean Ukrainian efforts to defend itself against that thrust of the Russian military and the withdrawal of the Russians from that area, that has given us a new opportunity for further understanding in that direction. My own feeling is that as this process goes ahead, we will see more clearly how and in what way the various alternatives for the future will develop. I think those who are early on predicting a Ukrainian victory over the Russians are greatly to be enjoyed, enormously to be congratulated, but in this point dealt with skeptically until we see how in the future weeks this military contest continues. I'm not sure how that will happen. I was in Russia at the time of the first Chechen War, which went very much like what has happened in Ukraine in the first months of this war. Years later, there was a second Chechen War, and that went in an entirely different direction. I'm not sure what will happen here, and I'm not sure how it will play out. Secondly, I mentioned 4 sources of force here. Dr. Wharton referred to them a minute ago. I think that those can build up enormous pressures against Putin. Whether he will react to those pressures in a positive way or not remains completely, in my view, uncertain, but it is a major leverage point in our favor. We need to look at the question, if that is the case, whether they will produce a stalemate or a gradual erosion of one position of one side or the other that can open the way for a negotiated process. If there is a negotiated process, how will it come out? Each side has changed their position in the Ukraine-Russia conversations, as I have followed them over the last weeks, in accordance with a reflection of their views of the military issues that are involved. But each side now has a maximalist position of recovering the maximum amount of territory it could possibly gain as a result of complete takeover or complete loss of Ukrainian territory and independence. That is not a totally unexpected result, but it is not a result, obviously, that can produce something called an arrangement or a deal or a treaty or a ceasefire or a situation which improves the lives of the people directly involved. And we're dealing with human lives on an everyday basis. And the notion that countries would continue, as Russia has in its invasion, to continue to sacrifice people's lives with seemingly very little in the way of gains and very little down the road is encouraging in the medium term, but very discouraging in the short term. And one would hope that there will be some efforts further to generate a ceasefire, even if in effect that doesn't create yet a permanent solution. The ceasefire would relieve the toll of casualties and the toll of death that obviously is inherent in the present situation.
Ambassador, thanks for that answer. Just wanted to do a quick time check. We're at 10:07, I guess 11:07 on the East Coast. Are you okay? Can you take a couple more questions?
Yeah, why don't we sort of go on until 15 after, and I'll try to make my answers shorter. It gives me an opportunity, however, to give an answer to several questions.
Perfect. So I'd like to turn first to Keith. Keith, can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yes, hello. Good morning, and thank you again for speaking with us, Ambassador Pickering. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Give me 1 second to pull the question up. Here we go. Okay. So you spoke earlier about it being important that both sides come to the table to have discussions, both the adversaries and our side in this case. But earlier this week, the Prime Minister of Estonia said that we need to stop calling Putin because we need to make sure that he knows that he's isolated on the political or the diplomatic table. I was wondering how you would coincide the two, like how you'd find, I guess, a happy medium between the two, between making sure that he knows he's isolated, but also having the conversations that we would need to end the conflict as it stands now.
No, I think that's a fair question. My own feeling, however, is that the content of the conversations will reveal to Mr. Putin the depth of isolation much better than the absence of communications will reveal that. It's better for you to explain all of the facets of dislike to President Putin firsthand from a fellow head of state than it is to allow the absence of phone calls somehow to impose themselves on his consciousness in a way that will give you creative leverage.
And there was also a question, I think Keith had a second one, about how do diplomats handle inconsistencies between the promises that they make while they're negotiating with foreign governments abroad, and then how do they message that back to an American government, an American public that might be skeptical to that? And so how to reconcile that?
I think first and foremost, Corey, that diplomats have an obligation before they produce inconsistencies for a foreign party to solve the inconsistencies with Washington, so that they have the obligation to say, you just told me this, and last week you told me that. Which is the prevailing view at the present time, and which one do I present? Or if they're a little smarter than that, go back and say, these are the two things I've heard, and here's how I can wrap them up together in a useful way without being so incredible that the other side will not give me the time of day.
All right, Michael, do we have you? Or I think you said, should I ask your question? Are you there, Michael? Okay, Ambassador. So Michael's question is basically about NATO. He writes that NATO has been criticized for lacking a goal and becoming weaker. How do you view NATO, and how do you view NATO's future, especially considering the application of some European governments such as Sweden and Finland to join the military alliance?
It's a great question. I would say Michael should hopefully breathe a little less heavily, that now we have an aim, which is obviously to prevent Russia from taking over Ukraine and doing all we can to reestablish sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence for all of Ukraine. And I don't think that NATO has hidden those objectives or is in any way hiding behind disputes over those objectives, and that's important. Secondly, we owe Mr. Putin a big vote of thanks because his audacious misbehavior has driven NATO together as it hasn't been together for the last decade. And I think that that's valuable and important. It has also done something that Mr. Putin railed against, which is more states joining NATO. Now, we have a Turkish objection to Finland and Sweden joining. The American Secretary of State has spoken rather positively about being able to work out that Turkish objection, and I have full confidence that as he speaks, he has good knowledge about how to make that happen. And I think there are ways to do that, many ways, and that Mr. Erdogan needs to be worked with, just as Finland and Sweden work with others among the 30 members of NATO to be sure that when their question is finally considered, the NATO answer will be positive. It would be embarrassing and discouraging if two well-equipped states who provided for their own future defense throughout the Cold War and now want to become part of a stronger partnership to which they can contribute greatly would be rebuffed at the entrance gate.
Okay, let's try to do 2 more questions so we can end at a quarter after, as you requested. And so, Jake, can you please unmute Mr. Jake
Yes,
Travis?
I'm here. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. I had a question about your career. Of all the positions you've held in your life, which of them was the most difficult initially and which required you to learn the most on the spot?
I think, Jake, it's a very interesting question. I hadn't quite looked at it that way, most difficult to buy onto. I think your first ambassadorship was always a big challenge. I went to Jordan. Jordan was a very friendly country. I had been working with Dr. Henry Kissinger on problems that Jordan was very interested in. So I went with a depth of knowledge and with a sense of confidence that helped me overcome those initial uncertainties. I went to other places where I never thought I would go. I was not a Russian or Soviet expert when I went to Russia right after Robert Strauss, who was the ambassador who saw the demise of communism and the emergence of a non-communist Russia. But I had a lot to learn, and I had luckily a huge staff, but a very able one. And I spent a lot of time with that staff, learning from them as much as I possibly could, as rapidly as I could. And by then I had been in a number of embassies. And so I had a little bit of how to defeat or at least manage the learning curve in hand as I went. A good bit of that was studying up in Washington before I went, because of course I had my hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in which I had to demonstrate the knowledge that I had achieved of Russia and the view I had about how to solve a number of the problems. And Russia was in those days front and center, just as it is now, in a somewhat different guise then. We were looking to Russia as a potential partner, as someone who could, in one way or another, help in stabilizing European security, that could become a commercial partner, and which could play a role in dealing with major world problems together with the US and the other permanent members of the UN Security Council. I think the most interesting job I had was one we discussed a minute ago with Professor Morton, I believe it was, and it was my first year and a half at the United Nations, which culminated in the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and then a very intensive period in which the Security Council passed 12 resolutions and culminating in the resolution authorizing the use of force to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait. Security Council, in effect, passed a giant resolution as the peace treaty with Iraq at the end of that war, and under which conditions Iraq had to do a number of things to make good the damage it had done to Kuwait and the world community as a result of that invasion.
Ambassador, thanks so much for answering these questions. We're right at a quarter after. Just before we end, I believe that Stefan wanted to take a group photo. So I think we'll all need to turn on our cameras so he can take a group photo. We could memorialize this moment.
Turn on your cameras. Essentially, the way this is going to work is I'm just going to take a screenshot. I have an extra big monitor here, so everyone should be on screen here. Just waiting for everyone. I see, let's see, the people that are not yet. Oh, okay, we're still going. Okay, we have a. Okay, we have a few people who are still missing. I'm going to give you guys 10 more seconds. Okay, everyone ready? In 3, 2, 1. Alrighty, thank you so much. So this is the end of our presentation. I want to thank you all for coming. Ambassador Pickering, it's an immense honor to have you here with us. So thank you for joining. Again, thank you to Miko for helping make this possible and for joining us all the way from Japan. Skip would have been so pleased with the reception that we got today. You know, Skip truly did love this program. When he and I first created it and in its first version, he would send me emails literally every day, excited about when's the next event. He cared so much about the FAU community. He cared so much about raising global literacy and really helping students reach that next level. The ability to connect with ambassadors, with diplomats, to learn more about the world around them is an immense pleasure. I think it's one of the greatest gifts that one can get. So, Ambassador Pickering, thank you so much for spending your time with us. We learned so much, and just to meet you alone is one of the greatest honors that we could have. So, thank you.
Thank you.
So, Ambassador Pickering, I'm going to give you the chance if you want to say any closing thoughts you may have. Included in that, I do know that Corey kind of picked up on this topic a little bit while my internet went out, but I would love to know if there's anything that you wish you knew back when you were our age, still an undergraduate, that you wish to impart on us. And before I give you the chance to close, I just want to let you guys know that this program will be broadcast on YouTube and that we will have more events like this where we have ambassadors, we have diplomats, people in government agencies from State Department, USAID, Asian Development Bank. We even have representatives from private corporations such as Chevron, who they deal with international affairs. We have a lot coming up for you guys. Stay tuned. Make sure that you are registered on our website and or app so that you stay up to date. I want to thank our partners at FAU, including Dr. Tunick of the Honors College, Dr. Morden, Dean Horswell, Dr. Lowe, Dr. Morden, Dr. Wagner. If I missed you, I'm so sorry. Anyone else? But your help in helping spread the word has been essential. You were all close friends of Skip. Skip really cared about you all, so thank you so much. Dr. Ambassador Pickering, we'll end with you.
Thank you, Stefan, very much. It's been a pleasure and honor to speak with all of you. I thought there were great questions in a wide range, and I was happy to have a chance to work with you on answering those. Thank you, Stefan and Corey. Thank you, Miko, very much for your very kind words and remarks. It was great to hear from so many other people and to have their questions, and I hope you find this a useful program. I certainly enjoyed making it and enjoyed seeing all of you, and wish you all the best in the future and for the program that was is very much instrumental in skip zone thinking and skip zone legacy. And we want to have this stay in living memory of him. So all good wishes and many thanks, and have a wonderful weekend, all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. This was about Ukraine. I must say that our hearts go out to everyone in Ukraine, all the people who have lost their lives, their homes, and their livelihood. We hope that this has a quick resolution. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.